Growing up playing basketball in upstate New York during the early 2000s, the flex offense was everywhere. My high school coaches, my AAU coaches, at camps, at clinics, everyone was running the flex. And as a result, I could have run through the flex pattern in my sleep. Screen across, screen down, screen across, screen down, and repeat. It's no coincidence that around that same time, several college teams were winning big with flex offenses. In 1999, Gonzaga's flex gave us this legendary call from Gus Johnson.
The flipper still fits!
In 2002, Maryland and Gary Williams won the national championship with the flex. A few years later, Bruce Pearl and Wisconsin Milwaukee upset their way to the Sweet 16 using the offense. And at the same time, Boston College and Al Skinner had some of their best seasons in program history, starting 20-0 in 2005 and then following that up with a Sweet 16 appearance in 2006. Skinner and his star player Jared Dudley used an especially extreme version of the flex that would in turn be imitated by high school coaches around the country. But during all of that success 20 years ago, the flex was still a polarizing topic even back then. A Baltimore Sun article from 2003 wrote about how the offense was back in favor after once being thought of as old-fashioned, with Gary Williams quoted as saying, "I remember an NCAA show from a couple years ago where some pretty prominent coaches talked about it being out of date, but we were still playing and their teams weren't."
For those that really don't respect the flex offense, I say let's play. Let's play because I think there are so many different things you can do out of it, especially when you have interchangeable pieces. And with those things, I think ultimately you can have success.
While it's certainly true that the flex has won its fair share of games, the critics of the offense have also been somewhat validated, especially over the past decade. Certain elements of the offense are still very common in the college game, especially on baseline out of bounds right after entering the ball into the elbow. But the days of college coaches using the pattern scheme as their primary offense are mostly in the past. Ed Cooley does still run it in short spurts, but even he has mostly centered his offense around ball screens at Providence instead.
Now they're running their flex offense, Providence. It's a really tight flex that Al Skinner used to run at Boston College when Ed was assistant.
In this video, we'll start with the history of the offense, who created it, how it got its name, and why it spread to coaches around the country and the world. We'll also look at the X's and O's of some of those great flex teams from the early 2000s already mentioned. And since the flex did have such a big impact on the high school level, I was left with no choice but to dust off some 2011 Bethlehem Central High School varsity basketball game film. You're probably thinking, why that random school? Well, that was my senior season where I was the starting point guard, and I'll show you how we use the flex. But before we start, I want to know what the main offense was that you grew up playing with. I noticed in other flex videos on YouTube, there's a bunch of funny comments from kids claiming their coach forced them to watch the video. But how about you? What did you grow up with? Maybe it wasn't flex. I have a feeling the answers will vary depending on where and when you grew up. So drop a comment below and let us know. Between hunting down old game footage and researching the history of the offense, a lot of work went into this video. So please remember to hit those like and subscribe buttons if you haven't already, and you can support the channel by signing up for our Hoop Vision newsletter. I'll be releasing bonus videos exclusively for Hoop Vision Plus subscribers with more analysis on the flex that didn't make the final edit of this video. Link is in the description. Thank you for watching. Determining the exact origins of a basketball player philosophy is usually tricky. With coaches changing jobs and scouting opponents, ideas spread quickly, but a lot of the flex's history is surprisingly well documented. Dr. Tom Davis is credited as the creator of the offense. In 1968, Davis took Pete Newell's reverse action, an offense that Newell used to win a national championship at Cal and an Olympic gold with Team USA, and combined that with an offense he learned while playing at a small college in Wisconsin. The result was a continuity-based scheme that he first called regular. Then in the 70s, Carroll Williams, the head coach at Santa Clara, started running the offense too, initially calling it by the name rigid because he only allowed his players to shoot layups out of it. When Williams started allowing for more freedom later in the season, he called that new version of the offense flexible, aka flex. When in flex, his players were allowed to shoot from anywhere on the court. Nowadays, the name has a different meaning. When a player located around the block screens across for a teammate in the corner, It's now known as a flex screen. That's likely not how Davis or Williams referred to that screen, but it's how the terminology has evolved over time. Davis was a D1 head coach at 5 different schools before retiring in 2007. Even at Drake, the last stop of his career, his team was still using the flex. They finished a very strong 37th in adjusted offensive efficiency in his final season, according to KenPom. Both Tom Davis and Carroll Williams had assistant coaches that carried on the flex legacy. Dan Fitzgerald was Williams' assistant at Santa Clara. He'd go on to coach Gonzaga for 15 seasons, in turn passing the flex along to coaches like Dan Munson and some guy named Mark Few.
Mark Few, we would be assistants and we'd be walking around, and he would walk by me every day because there's so many things with flex that you had to change and had to read and you had to counter with. And he'd walk by me and he says, "Flex sucks, pass it on. Flex sucks, pass it on." And so, he was Mr. Anti-Flex. And so when I took off to Minnesota and he's still running flex, and I'd say, "Mark, I thought flex sucks." He goes, "Yeah, but the kids like it."
Gary Williams and Bruce Pearl are both members of the Tom Davis coaching tree. They quickly became 2 of the biggest advocates for the flex. Pearl won a D2 national championship with the offense in 1995, 7 years before Williams won his D1 championship. Speaking of that Maryland national title, now let's talk some X's and O's. Back in 2002, the Maryland offense started with a very traditional inverted formation. 2 guards on the blocks and 2 bigs on the elbows. They initiated the offense using floppy action and pin downs to get the guards moving up towards the ball. Their star guard, Juan Dixon, would look to directly score off that initial action, using his shooting ability to hunt for jumpers or curl to the basket. Dixon averaged over 20 points per game that season while shooting 40% from 3. Here's a more recent example of West Virginia using the same floppy formation. With the defenders trying to aggressively deny the first action, that initial false motion sets up the flex screen to the basket. False motion can be an important part of the flex because it helps prevent the defense from being 2 steps ahead and cheating the play. Another one of the most important parts of the flex offense is what happens after the flex screen is set. In Gary Williams' version, his teams mastered the duck in. Here Maryland goes floppy to flex, but notice how the Kansas player is giving extra help on the screen, camping underneath the basket. To counter that defense, Maryland bigs would either flash or duck in after setting the flex. The duck in puts pressure on the defense. They'd like to give some extra help on the flex cut to avoid a layup, but if they do, that's going to put them a step behind when it comes to defending the duck in. The pattern of the flex inherently forces the defense to guard multiple actions in a row. And that's not even to mention that with 2 future NBA draft picks in Lonnie Baxter and Chris Wilcox, Maryland didn't even need much separation in order to be effective inside. Both players were dynamic with their backs to the basket, making the flex duck in that much harder to defend. If nothing was immediately open, Maryland would then get into their continuity, flex screening on the other side of the court, and then ducking in again, this time with that new screener. Theoretically, the Terps would repeat that pattern, switching sides of the court as many times as necessary. I actually think that if for some reason we were given the choice to rename Gary Williams' version of the flex offense to something besides flex, the better and more descriptive title would just be continuity ducking. Here's former Maryland assistant coach Jimmy Patsos running the same flex continuity with Siena, but on the 3rd flex screen of the possession, the Saints like to look for the alley-oop lob play, lulling the defense to sleep on the first 2 screens and then striking on the 3rd. Back to 2002 now, Gary Williams also catered his offense to his best players. During the national championship game against Indiana, the Terps kept things very simple by just rubbing off the post and throwing the ball right inside, letting their bigs go to work. It was very simple offense, but simple works just fine with the right talent. Juan Dixon's ability to read the defense when coming off the flex screen was a big reason why he won ACC Player of the Year. One of his go-to moves was to fake the cut to the basket and flare into the corner for a 3 instead. Similar to Dixon, the next team we're going to look at also had a future NBA player that was a master at making reads out of the flex: Boston College and Jared Dudley. It can be jarring to watch the spacing in Al Skinner's tight flex offense, especially compared to present-day offenses where 4 or 5 players spread out along the perimeter. This almost looks like an entirely different sport. But for Skinner, that spacing was by design. Boston College players were taught to play through the elbows.
You want to teach posting the elbow, and this is going to become a war. So if you're trying to deny me the ball, I want to teach our guys to get over this top leg, top foot. We want to get our into them. We want to be physical, and we want to give an outside bounce pass, right? You want to shrink the pass with your length. There you go, better. So now we got the ball where we want it.
Instead of using perimeter spacing to open up the court and generate baskets, BC did it with strength and physicality, battling the defense on the interior for positioning, drawing fouls, and offensive rebounding missed shots. Just like Maryland, BC was looking for layups on the baseline off of the flex screen. That was the first option. But instead of using the Gary Williams duck in, the Eagles complemented the flex screen by then setting a second screen, also known as screen the screener action. It's still a continuity-based offense, but just with a different pattern than the one that Maryland used. And it's this pattern, the screen across then screen down, that was copied by so many high school coaches around the country. Watch these two plays to start the game against Kansas. We again see the insanely tight spacing, but also pay attention to the dribble.
Flex offense, Al Skinner wants his guys to pass the ball rather than dribble it. Very patient. They'll go late into the shot.
In Skinner's flex, the Eagles could go entire possessions without putting the ball on the floor, just relying on that pattern movement and physicality instead. Again, it's kind of like they're playing a different sport altogether.
They get the basketball down. It's unbelievable. They call it a flex offense. They keep packing it in. A lot of cutting, a lot of movement, a lot of passing, not much dribbling. And now the Eagles are off the mark again.
To be fair, there really wasn't anywhere to dribble even if they wanted to with that tight spacing. 4 guys were usually near the paint. The advantage of the tight spacing and catching at the elbow is it shortens the length of the pass inside to the cutter. Watch how Marshall gets pushed off of the elbow here because of ball pressure. The cut is open for a split second, but it's a tougher pass to make when you're farther out. This style of tight flex is a game of inches. In general, BC was usually great at winning that game of inches. Like Maryland, they were fantastic at reading the defense and playing off of screens, keeping opponents on their toes by slipping after setting the pin down, rejecting the pin for a lob to the basket instead, or rejecting the flex to pop out for a three-pointer. Jared Dudley was a perfect fit for the flex. He could shoot, he had elite feel and IQ when coming off of screens, and he had the strength to overpower defenders inside. Here he catches his man cheating the play and does that same Juan Dixon corner flare move. On this one he does it again, but then draws the foul when his defender scrambles back. Dudley showed his versatility in the ACC championship. With Duke putting smaller defenders on him, Al Skinner posted Dudley up against players like JJ Redick and Greg Pauls. This play might be the best example of how BC's offense was so efficient in spite of the spacing. On the entry pass to the elbow, the defender falls down. Dudley passes, but then cuts for a quick give and go. Even with a completely clogged paint, he throws a dime right through the defense for an easy layup. Again, no dribbles, just crisp passing. To avoid having to defend all of those reads and movement within the flex, BC opponents would often choose to get aggressive, both denying the ball reversals that are needed to continue the pattern, and then pressuring the ball if those reversals were completed. BC's counter to that pressure, besides just letting Dudley and Craig Smith go to work, was to use their flares option.
Now what I want to show you from the pin down is how to space this out. Now if you have an athletic group and you want more space for driving angles, now we flare out of it. Instead of pinning down, we really open the floor, and you're going to see this.
In the normal version of the offense, the ball would be reversed here for a flex screen. In the flares version, the screener comes up high to set a back screen instead. On that one, it led to an easy layup for Dudley, and on this one, Marshall gets an open 3 after setting the flare. By lifting the defense, the flares option could open up space on the inside a little more effectively than the traditional version of the tight flex.
I think you see the flex offense a lot in high school.
For years now, the flex has been perceived as an offense that's especially suitable for high school teams. Gary Williams was quoted back in 2003 saying, "I think it's a great high school offense because there's no shot clock. If it takes you a minute to get a good shot, you'll get a good shot." On a similar note, Tom Davis said, "It's easier for your less talented players. If you have the most talented team in your league, you might not need this offense. But if you have some guys in there that might need some help getting free, this offense might have some merit." Relatively speaking, the flex's pattern is easy for coaches to teach and for players to learn. It's also an equal opportunity offense, meaning all 5 players get a chance to both set screens and receive screens. And obviously it provides structure for players, or as Dan Munson calls it, a safety blanket.
The more I do it, the more I realize it's just like your kids at home. They act like they don't want structure, they act like they don't want discipline, but they do.
As someone who played in the flex back in high school, I think Munson makes an interesting point here. My senior season, we usually entered into the flex by starting 4 players on the baseline. After a big popped out, we were right into that flex screen. As the point guard, I'd initiate the offense by picking a side, then spin dribbling to enter the ball to the opposite elbow. That dribble helped with a couple things. First of all, this is the defender that's going to guard the first flex cut. By dribbling towards him, he's more likely to try denying and then in turn be unprepared for the eventual cut. And second of all, this defender was less likely to deny. Once we got the ball to that elbow, now we were in our comfort zone. So like Munson said, we wanted structure and discipline. There was definitely a feeling of safety once we were in the flex. But now looking back on it, I'm not sure I really see it as a strength of the offense. I kind of see it as a weakness. We were great when our opponents let us run the continuity, when we had the safety blanket, but in our biggest games, we struggled against disruptive defenses. In order to maintain the structure of the flex, certain passes almost need to be made. Otherwise, the pattern falls apart. At times, I think trying to maintain the pattern of the offense became more important than trying to score the ball. Ideally, coaches should be striving to grow players that don't need a security blanket. Players that can dribble, pass, shoot, and read the floor even without a rigid structure. Gonzaga is one of the best examples of that idea. With the shot clock off, they start out in flex. But it's hard to run a continuity offense when the shot clock is winding down. After backing it out for a sloppy ISO, Stanford is the one that scores to end the half. The Zags went from running flex in the early 2000s to running continuity ball screen in the 2010s to now landing on an offensive system that organically flows into ball screens and other actions without relying on a strict pattern. Mark Few has been willing to change as the game has changed. But in addition to fewer teams relying on continuity offenses, there's an even bigger offensive shift that's happened over the past 2 decades. And that leads us to our final section. The flex was created during a time where the three-point line literally didn't exist, and when our understanding of shot selection was different than it is today. After Boston College, Al Skinner went on to coach Kennesaw State from 2016 to 2019. In his last 2 seasons, the Owls were dead last in the country in three-point attempts while still running the tight flex. During the 2019 season, 64% of all Kennesaw jump shots were mid-range 2-pointers. Only one other team in the country was even over 50% that season. Skinner's protege, Ed Cooley, has also produced offenses that don't shoot a lot of threes. The season before Cooley took the job, Providence was ranked 153rd in three-point attempts. With Cooley, they fell to 330. And the numbers show a similar story for the Gary Williams duck-in style of flex. In his last season at Maryland, the Terps ranked 342nd. When Mark Turgeon took over, they moved to 261. Of course, every flex team is looking to get easy layups off the action, but when it's not open, the action tends to naturally default to either post-ups off the duck-ins or mid-range jumpers off of the pin-downs. Those are the exact 2 types of shots that have decreased the most in the 4-out and 5-out era of basketball, especially at the highest levels of the sport. But that's not to say the flex can't be spread out to accommodate for the three-point line. That 1999 Gonzaga team actually shot more threes than the 2021 Gonzaga team did this season. They used the pin down flex like Boston College, but spread out on the perimeter instead of catching at the elbow. Watch right after the flex screen here. The Stanford defender is expecting the normal pin down, but as he turns his head, Gonzaga sneaks across instead for the 3. Bruce Pearl is one of the most interesting flex disciples. His teams have always had a run and gun reputation, letting it fly from 3 in transition even during a time period where most coaches didn't allow their teams to let it fly from 3 in transition. At Wisconsin-Milwaukee, his play players used that flare move off the flex we've already seen multiple times, but they also used a different concept, popping the screener for a 3 after setting the flex. That screen and pop action is a prominent part of Wisconsin's swing offense, created by Bo Ryan and now run by Greg Gard. The swing's not exactly the flex, but it uses ball reversals and flex cuts to get different players in and out of the post, while also having 4-out spacing that allows for more perimeter play. Wisconsin was in the top 103 point attempts in all 6 of Bo Ryan's final seasons in Madison, despite playing out of the post so often. There's another prominent member of the flex coaching tree that we're missing. Tom Davis's son, Keno Davis, is currently the head coach of Central Michigan. In his first season at CMU, they actually led the entire country in 3-point attempts, running a version of his father's offense that incorporated more freedom and more stagger screens.
Variation of the flex that we run, as this pass goes guard to guard and you would normally just get your baseline cut, we're actually going to give our offensive player an option on this where he's going to be set a flex screen coming here to go on the baseline screen, or we have a down screen for him to be able to come off on a single screen.
While Keno Davis and Bruce Pearl have shown it's possible to modernize the flex, it's also especially telling that both coaches, and Mark Few and Dan Munson and Ed Cooley, all those coaches have used the offense less and less over the years in favor of more ball screens. With defenses now prioritizing taking away the 3, it's never been easier for the offense to gain an advantage by just spreading the court and naturally flowing into ball screens or dribble handoffs. By comparison, the flex makes it harder to maintain spacing, has a higher risk of turnovers for players trying to continue that continuity, and doesn't have ball screens in it. But even though now for most college teams the flex is either gone entirely or only reserved for special situations and quick hitters, there's still a lot to be learned about playing within a system and reading the defense from the coaches that made it famous, even if it is just a high school offense. Thank you very much for watching. A reminder that I'm going to be releasing a follow-up to this video exclusively for HV Plus subscribers. That video will be more like a coach's film room session, with the counters, set plays, and general observations that didn't make the final edit of this one. A subscription to Hoop Vision Plus is $10 a month or $100 for the year, and it allows us to keep making deep dive videos about an offense from the 1970s. Thanks again, and see you in the next one.
The flex offense is a lot of fun.